We're going to look at a Rashi and Rabbi Kiveger, and hopefully we'll get to an insight of Rabbi Shmuel and maybe even Rabbi Nachum. And this is all summarized in an overview here in the Yalkut Bi'urim on page Yud Gimel. And on the right column, you'll see a title that says Elu Nashim Choltzos Afal Pisha Einon Misyabmos. And we're talking about the possibility that there could be Yibum. There could be Chalitza even without a possibility of Yibum. Meaning, what we want to analyze is whether or not Chalitza can be categorized independent of Yibum. Rashi claims that you could exhaust all cases of Chalitza without Yibum under one heading, and that's Suffolk. So let's say, for example, we have a Suffolk Erva. Now, in a Suffolk Erva, for example, let's say a woman received a get, but we're not sure if the get is kosher, if it was closer to her, closer to him when he threw it, etc., etc. And now, Hatzara is also a Suffolk Erva. In such cases, we're not going to allow Yibum because we can't take the chance, run the risk of his having a relationship with an Erva, and we have a Suffolk Erva. But on the other hand, he has to give a Chalitza because on the tzad that she's not an Erva or Hatzar is not a Tzaras Erva, then she cannot get married to anyone else. So she's a Suffolk as far as the Shuk is concerned, getting married to somebody else. So on the tzad that she would be obligated to Yibum, which we don't know that that's so, then she needs Chalitza. Rabbi Kiva Eger, in his comment in Gilyon HaShas, refers to a sugya later on in Daf Chaf Aleph, and he thinks that he has a problem, an objection to Rashi based on the sugya on Daf Chaf Aleph. So we're going to get a little bit of a taste of a sugya that's coming down the line. We have cases where the Yavama is not an Erva, but rather she is what's called a Lav and an Esek. We're going to see this in the case of an Almana L'Kohen Gadol. What does it mean, a Lav and an Esek? You see, what we're trying to set up here is that although if she's not an Erva, she's only Asur B'Lav, we would apply the principle of Yibum overriding the Lav. That's called Esei Docha Los Eseh. But if her status is both that of a Lav and an Esei, then we have a principle, Ein Esei Docha Los Eseh V'Esei. I mean, all this sounds very abstract, but we'll flesh it out. So the Gemara talks about a case of an Almana L'Kohen Gadol. Now, with regard to the status of an Almana L'Kohen Gadol, we have two different prohibitions. One is a Lav, because the Torah says in Parshas Emor, Almana lo yikach. Oh, he tells you where to find it, fine, in the footnote. And there's also an essay, because the Torah, in the same pasuk, says, V'hu isha b'psulea yikach, that he has to marry a basula. So if he marries an almana, he not only violates a los aseh, but he violates an essay as well. Now let's assume that his brother is married and dies without children. His brother's wife now falls for Yibum, but she happens to be an almana. Now what that means is that since her husband died, so let's say you have Reuven's the Kohen Gadol, his brother Shimon is a Kohen Hedjot. Kohen Hedjot marries a woman. There's no reason why he shouldn't marry her. And now this Kohen Hedjot, we call him Shimon, dies. His wife falls for Yibum to Reuven. Reuven is the Kohen Gadol. Reuven can't marry an almana. Well, let's apply the principle of Esei Docha Los Aseh. The essay of Yibum should override the Los Aseh of Almana Lo Yikach. But there's a problem. Because although an essay can override a Los Aseh, it cannot override a Los Aseh and an essay. And the classic example of a Los Aseh and an essay is Yontif. Let's say Yontif, the Torah says Tishbos, which is an essay, and the Torah says Lotasu, Komlech Samud Lotasu. So if you would have an essay that would override Yontif, under the law of essay dochalosa, you'd have a problem here because Yontif is both an essay and a lotas. Here, in the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, we cannot apply the principle of essay dochalosa. So because the Almana, the situation of the Almana vis-a-vis the Kohen Gadol is that of a losa and an essay. So what do we do in this case? So the Gemara Daf Chaf Aleph says that she'll need chalitza, but there's no possibility of yibum. And the Gemara says that although we have a principle kol she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola chalitza, and she should be classified as ena ola liyibum, ipso facto ena ola lechalitza. So how can you tell me that she needs chalitza? And the Gemara answers because the pasuk says that the olsa yivimto hashar. In other words, when do you require chalitza? When does the Torah require chalitza? That's only the olsa yivimto hashara, meaning when she presents herself, hashara means in front of the Beis Din, as a potential yevamot for the mitzvah of yibum. And that is a miut, meaning that the Torah is saying that she, since she's also yevimto hashara, therefore she requires chalitza. But another woman, yesh lecha, you have another woman who is a yevama that doesn't lend herself and doesn't have the possibility of yibum, but she's ola lechalitza. So again, the Torah is giving you a general rule that you need also liyibum in order to have a requirement of chalitza. If there's no also liyibum, there's no requirement of chalitza. But since the Torah adds the word the also, meaning she requires yibum in order to require chalitza, there's another woman, and she is categorically defined as a woman who doesn't have yibum but does have chalitza. And what exactly is that case? That's the case of a yavama whose isur on the yavam is both an essay and a los essay, which makes it impossible to apply the principle of essay docha losas. And therefore she's obligated in chalitza. And the Gemara explains that an erva who's in an isur kares, she is excluded from chalitza as well as yibum. And that's because ein kedushin tofsin. She's completely excluded from issues with regard to this person because to him she's got a chiyuv kares. That's a real erva. And ein kedushin tofsin b'arayos. However, in the case of chayve lavim or chayve esin, there is tfisas kedushin, and therefore she's ola l'chalitza. Meaning, what's the idea of chalitza? There's a zika between the yivama and the yavam. Well, in this case, there is a zika because although he's not allowed to marry her, if he would go ahead and marry her, then the marriage would be valid. And in that case, in order to remove the zika sibum, you require chalitza. In any event, all this is against Rashi. Rashi says, there's no case whatsoever of a woman who requires chalitza, not yibum, unless it's a suffix, like for example, a suffix eshesish, a suffix erva. Here we have a case which is not a suffix at all. We know exactly her status, and because she's included in both a lav and an essay as an almana l'kohen gadol, therefore there's no possibility of yibum, and yet there is chalitza. So there are no sveikas over here. Now, I mentioned to you that there's a Rosh Hashiva named Rav Shimon Shkop, and he's very often quoted by his Talmidim. One of his outstanding Talmidim was Rav Shmuel Rozovsky, and Rav Shmuel was a Talmid of Rav Shimon Shkop in Grodno, back in Lita. And Rav Shimon Shkop had created that yeshiva at some point I think it was in the early 30s, 1930s. Shimon left Europe, came to America, and he taught for approximately, I think it's about 8 months at Yeshiva University. It wasn't called Yeshiva University at that time. It was called Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. That was the name of the yeshiva. And then he went back to Europe. They say that the yeshiva in Europe forced him back. They wouldn't allow him to stay at YU. In any event, Rav Shmuel quotes his Rebbe Rav Shimon in a new light, shedding a new light on the principle of Kol She'eino Ola Lib. And he says the following. When we talk about Eina Ola Liyibum, a woman who's excluded from Yibum, we have to subdivide it into two fundamentally different categories. There's one category of Yivama that's Asura Liyava, which means that although she is included in Yibum, but there's a barrier and a blockage that doesn't allow the Yibum to come to fruition. The impediment and the blockage is an Isur. The Yesh, but there's another category, Shehi Ptura Mi'ikar Din Yibum, that she's not included in the mitzvah of Yibum. You may remember that we spoke once about islandness, and we said that the Torah says in Yula that as a result, the goal and the agenda of Yibum is that she should give birth. But if she's not capable of giving birth, she's not included in the parsha of Yibum. So that's called Ein La Din Yibum. She's not at all included in Yibum. Not that there's a blockage. In the first category, there is Yibum, and there should be Yibum, but we can't allow Yibum. So it's a problem in what we call the implementation. The kiyum of Yibum is impossible as a result of the Isur. He says, Erva, Neseres B'Yibum, Mishum She'ein Esei Dochalosa, says Sheyesh Bo Karetz. So here we have a case of a blockage, an Isur, that prevents the implementation of Yibum. Achnol Vadzos, but in addition to that, Hatorah Patrasa B'Yibum Migzeret Shava, the Aleha Aleha. Avo v'chayve essay lo nemar shub tur mi'ibum. So in the case of chayve krisus of your classic erva, we start with an isur and we end with a ptur. Ptur meaning that we remove the entire mitzvah of yibum. She's not including yibum. We start with isur kares, and as a result of isur kares, we derive from aleha that she's completely exempt from Yibum. However, b'chayve essay lo nemar shub ptur miyibum. The Torah didn't exclude a chayve essay situation from Yibum, elo, but rather enim yicholos lisyavim machma she'eni suran nidche mipnei mitzvahs Yibum. That mitzvahs Yibum doesn't have the power to override the essay that prevents this marriage from happening. In other words, we have now one pasuk that says he should be biyavim, and that's the mitzvah Yevama Yavoleh. And then we have the Isur essay that the Torah says that he's not allowed to marry her because he has to marry a besula. Let's say in the case of Konda. Lo yachotza ish lekachas. Now we look at the pasuk of Chalitza, and the pasuk of Chalitza says that this man refuses to marry her. And v'yivimto melamed she'af mi she'ena misyaberes ola lechalitza. So the pasuk says that yivimto, also yivimto hashara, implying that the yivama does require either yibum or chalitza. But on the other hand, the Torah says lo yachotz ish lakachas, which means that the reason why there is a requirement of chalitza is because he doesn't want to give yibum, he refuses to be miyabim, implying that if she's eina mitzvah bemes, then there's no requirement of chalitza. The whole essence of chalitza is lo yachotz. He doesn't want to be miyabim. On the other hand, we have the pasuk, the also yevimto ashara, which means that a woman who is not misyabenes is ola chalitza, correct? Because we said there was a miut, and the miut told me the olsa yevim to ashar, that she could have had yibum and therefore she requires chalitza. But there's another woman that even though she does not have the option of chalitza is of yibum is not an option, nevertheless she requires chalitza, like for example, chaviyese that we spoke of. So how do we sort this all out? How do we reconcile these two drushas? One drasha that indicates that if there's no choice for yibum, then there's no requirement of chalitza. And the other was the miyad of Yolsi Yivim Tashara, from which you derived that even in the absence of chalitza, of yibum as a possibility, there will be a requirement of chalitza. We're going to take one of these two psukim, and we're going to interpret it as referring to chayve kares. And in the case of chayve kares, we're going to apply the principle of lo yachkotz ish lakachas, that only a woman whose yavam refused to be b'yamim, she requires chalitza. But a chayve krisa situation where he didn't refuse to be b'yamim, but where the Torah says he's not allowed to be b'yamim, then we don't apply that principle. The echanam, but the other pasuk, the miyud of the also yivim to ashara, we're going to interpret as referring to chayve lav and the esir. And the Torah is telling you that in those cases she requires chalitza. That was the miyud of the also yivim to ashara, to say that there is a case where there's no yibum, but there is chalitza, and that's going to be the case of chayve lav and the esir. Umistaver lahamed es aposko rishon the erva she'enu misyabemes machmas tur. In other words, the Torah completely removes her from the mitzvah of yibum, and therefore there's no requirement of chalitza. Second pasuk, it's logical to assume, is referring to chavayese, etc., where the reason why there's no yibum is because of the isa, the blockade that prevents yibum from taking place. The Torah never removes her from the mitzvah and the zik of yibum. Harei hein cholzos. Although the isa prevents yibum, but she nevertheless requires chalitza. So this is the presentation of Rav Shimon Shkop. And now we have to see if we can plug this into Rashi and explain the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol. Lefi zeh miyushalim divrei Rashi sheli ola misha hi p'tur miyavam nifteres af michalitza. What Rashi said is absolutely correct. Rashi said that only in a case of a suffix erva, where we don't know if she's included in the parasha or not, she'll require chalitza mitzat suffix. However, what about the second category, where the Torah requires chalitza? Rashi wasn't addressing that. Elachayve esei cholzos, like the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, she requires chalitza. Mishum she'enon begeder, we're not including her in kol she'ena ol yibum, ena ol chalitza, because we have the miyut of the also yivim to ashara to teach me that there is a case of a woman and a category who requires chalitza even though she's not in the parsha of yibum. And she's not potter, it's just that we cannot allow him to implement the mitzvah of yibum because ein essay docha, an essay cannot override an essay in a los essay. So b'poal hein menuos milischayev machmas isuron, although there won't be able to be in actuality, that's called the fall, a kiyum of this mitzvah of yibum because of the issue that blockades that prevents that, but nevertheless, she is included in chalitza. That was not the discussion of Rashi. You know, Rashi was talking about the principle of culture, Eina Ola Liyibum, Eina Ola Chalitza. And that principle, according to Rashi, only applies as derived from the pasuk of Lo Yachpotza each Lekach in a case of an error, where the Torah actually said there's a tour of Yibum. But as far as another category is concerned, and that's a Ptur Yibum that's derived from the pasuk also Yivim Tashara, that Ptur does not apply in the case of Chavi Esei and Chavi Lavin, for example, in Almana L'Kohen Gadol. Al Kain Kosev, that's what Rashi means when he says, Shalomatzinu Chalitza B'Vicheda Ola Yibum. In other words, Rashi is specifically addressing the principle of Kol Shein Ola Yibum. Like, for example, an Erva who's P'tura Yibum, is then there's no Chalitza unless you have a Safek Erva. But there's another category of a woman who is not P'tura Yibum, it's just a problem of an Isur, and that's the essay Losa, so like a Kohen Gadol Almana. Here we derive from the pasuk we also Yevinta Shara that she does require chalitza, and Rashi doesn't deny that. Rashi's not addressing the category and the drasha that we derive from the also Yevinta Shara. Rashi's only focused on Lo Yachpotza Ish L'Kachta, which is the principle called Sheina Ole Li'ibim is a P'tur Yibum Eina Ole L'Chem. And I think that this piece from Reb Shimon is very, very fundamental. It's almost, it has to be included, I think, in any introduction to Masechet Yevamot, because it's going to tie together the sugya here on Daf Gimel with the sugya on Chaf Aleph, and the apparent stira from Chaf Aleph to Rashi here in our sugya. And to reconcile that, we have to have these two categories, these two drashas, and they are fundamentally different, one from the other. One category is a p'tur, and when there's a p'tur yibum, there's no chalitza, and that's derived from lo yachpota ish lekachta, which means that the whole essence of chalitza is that he refused to fulfill his mitzvah of yibum. But if there's no mitzvah of yibum, and she's out of the ballpark of yibum, then there's no chalitza, as opposed to the drasha of the also Yevinta Shara, which implies that there is another Yevama that does require chalitza. That's a case where there's no P'tur Yibum, it's just that we cannot allow him to implement and be Makayim Yibum because of the essay and the losas involved in the case of Al-Madhu. Very, very fundamental. Now, Rashi's principle that in a case of a suffix, and we cannot allow Yibum because of a suffix, will require chalitza. That principle of Rashi has to be understood, has to be analyzed. It's not so posh. Why? And now we're going to quote a sugya, another sugya, not the one on Chaf Aleph, but rather one on Mem Aleph. And this is the sugya of Havchana. Try to explain. I just want to underline. We have a principle called Havchan. Shimon dies, Nebuch without children, but we don't know, and we cannot know, that his wife, his almana, after he dies, is she pregnant? Is she not? Perhaps they had an intimate relationship within the last period of time, and unbeknown to us, she's pregnant. The woman doesn't start showing until 3 months have passed since conception. So today we have ultrasounds. Maybe the halacha will change. I don't know. That you have to really ask Dr. Steinberg. In any event, we know now that toch gimel chadoshim mimisas baila. If Shimon dies, then we have to wait a 3-month period of time before Yibum could take place. Because although it seems that his wife Leah is not pregnant, I mean, she didn't have any children from Shimon, as far as we know, but nevertheless, she might be pregnant. And the Gemara says, Af eina ola lechalitza. The Gemara is going to apply the principle that kol shein ola liyavam eina ola lechalitza. Now, wait a second. The reason why she's not ola liyibum is because of a suffix. And Rashi tells us here on Daf Gimel that whenever there's a situation of a suffix, okay, as far as Yibum is concerned, we cannot allow Yibum. We cannot allow ourselves that luxury. But nevertheless, she needs Chalitza. And yet the Gemara says over there on Daf Mem Aleph in the case of Shlosha Chadashim that Eino Ola Chalitza. Why not? I mean, the whole business here of Yibum is a suffix business. And Rashi says that when there's a suffix, then we should require Chalitza. The Gemara itself raises this question. Why should the case of Gimel Chadashim, meaning within the 3 months after the death of the Yavam, of Shimon, doesn't that fit into a classic situation of suffix? Is there Yibum? Is there not Yibum? Well, is she pregnant? Is she not pregnant? It's a suffix. We don't know. But I wouldn't say that she's Eino Ola Yibum. I mean, if you're going to say she's Eino Ola Yibum, then you might do away with the whole mitzvah of Yibum. The whole enterprise of Yibum might not apply, because you never know within a certain period of time when the man's wife, the late brother's wife, is pregnant or not pregnant. Although maybe what I just said is not 100% correct, because it could be that if she's already past the age of having children, then maybe there would be no suffering. But it's not shaykh to say that all of Yibum, the purpose of which is to produce zera, only applies in a case, right? And probably if she's a zkena, what we call, then she might have the same din of an island, which means that there is no Yibum. And that means that Yibum by definition applies to a woman who could have children. She's in the childbearing category. But now we have a suffix. So what are you going to tell me? Oh, she's not Ola Yibum because of the suffix? Maybe she's pregnant. Hello, what? It's a suffix. Okay, fine. But, we have a din of suffix. And in every case of suffix, we're going to require chalitza. So the Gemara answers that spekos ilu yovel yoanovi v'yivshod chayeves b'yivum v'aretis yavma keni really olol yovel aval yivamito shlosha chadashim af im yovel yov yomer she'ena b'beres harei tzricha la'amtin gimel chadash b'gzeres kachamim, and that's absolutely very fascinating, because what we're saying is that there are two categories of suffix. There's one category of suffix we simply don't know. If Eliyahu Hanavi would tell us, then we do know. There's another category of suffix where the Rabbanan, based on that suffix, they instituted a new law. They enacted an injunction. And that law says that a woman cannot fall for Yibum within the first 3 months of her husband's death. And he says that even should Eliyahu Hanavi come and promise us, it's even more reliable than an ultrasound, that she's not pregnant, it wouldn't change a thing. We still have to wait the 3 months, because the Chacham made a gzera, and that gzera applies straight across the board, without exception. So what I suggested to you before, that maybe today we wouldn't have to require that 3 month period because we have ultrasound. That's not true, at least at this point today, because that would be no better than Eliyahu Hanavi. And Gemara is saying that in the case of Eliyahu Hanavi, she's Eina Ola Yibum period during that 3 month period. Achosif Sham Rashi, Shebetoch Gimel Chadashim Yesh La Efsharut Lehamtin Im HaChalitza Ad Liachar Zman Zeh. Rashi says, in addition, that she could wait the 3 months and then she'll get chalitza. Aval kol elish rabbanan einon choltzos. Keep going. Achos zekukaso, achos chalitzaso, v'chein sofek soras erbo. Im nesar olel lachos. Mishum she'eino ol yavam. Is this again liola? So that what we have here from Rashi is that we're going to allow for chalitza, toch gimel chadoshim, even though, as a general rule, we're not going to allow chalitza. Chalitza is not an option. As we discussed yesterday, we don't just say, well, what do we lose by chalitza? Throw it in. Throw it into the pot. No. We don't allow that because of the rule of kol she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola chalitza. So in cases where there's no yibum, there's no chalitza. And Rashi says that this case of shlosha chadoshim is the exception to the rule. The rule is that even if the reason why there's no yibum is derabanan, like achos kukaso, achos chalitzaso, sofek zaras erva, in all those cases, the Rabbanan say there's no Yibum, then there is no Chalitza. But Rashi says, with regard to Gimel Chadoshim, there is a possibility of Chalitza. So we have to try to understand the sheet of Rashi. It seems that what Rashi is saying, if I understand correctly, we'll see the Marsha in a minute, is that there are two cases where the Rabbanon made it impossible for Yibum to take place. Two different categories. One is Hilchas Sfeikus. The Rabbanon were motivated by a suffix to completely prohibit Yibum. And that's going to apply in the case of Gimel Chadosh. We don't know if she's pregnant or not. We have other cases where even if we know, the Rabbanon said there's no Yibum. Once the Rabbanon say that it's a separate din, that there's no Yibum, then there's no chalitza. Because kol she'eino ola liyibum eino ola chalitza, we're not going to allow chalitza. It's not a luxury, an optional, voluntary chalitza. What do you lose? But in a case of safek, if we can postpone the chalitza until the moment that the safek is removed, then she could have chalitza. And that's going to be the case of Havchana. If we wait to 3 months out, then she can get chalitza after the 3 months. However, the case where the Rabbanan put their foot down and they instituted a hafkas yibum, then there's no chalitza. Kasav Shalom Arsha. Shesafek Tzoras Erva B'chti Naspo Shari Kfar Esbai B'Gemara Shesafek. Not sure what the next word is. I don't know. I'm going to write, take the liberty here, putting this word into brackets. Mem Yud, Mem Reish Yud. I thought it was Myri and there's a Yud missing, but Myri doesn't fit in there either. Let's read it like this. For Aspire B'Gemara, Shesafik Shapir Ola L'Chalitza. Shekain Im Yovo Eliyahu B'Yomar Shehein Chayolos. Right, that's in the classic case of Safek. Is then Harihein Olos Af L'Chalitza. The Imka Bishmai Galius and Payu Pturos Mabakach She Cholz. Alo Benkach Hein Mutarasli. So basically, just to summarize, everything that we've seen today in explaining Rashi seems to indicate that the principle of Kol She'ena Ola Liyibum, Ena Ola L'Chalitza, does not always apply. It's not one of these absolute rules. It will only apply when there's an element of vadai in the equation. For example, if the Rabbanon set up a vadai that there's no yibum, then kol sheina ol yibum eina ol lechalitza. But if there's an element of suffix, a suffix which theoretically could be clarified, then we will require chalitza. And we don't lose anything by the chalitza, because even if it turns out that she didn't need the chalitza, nothing tragic has taken place if she received chalitza. So again, kol she'ena ola le'yibu, ena ola le'chalitza, has to have an element of suffix to it. I'm sorry, scratch it. Has to have an element of vadai to it. But if there's an element of suffix, then despite the fact that there's no yibum, there would be chalitza. And that was the whole discussion that we had in Rav Shimon based on the Gemara Daf Chaf Aleph. Then in the case of Almana, the Kohen Gadol, she needs chalitza. And why does she need chalitza? Not because of suffix in that case, but because she's not a chiba kares, and therefore there was never a p'tur of yibum. Now we have another category called suffix, and now we have it as suffix erva, and we also have it in the case of gimel chadashim. The only problem is that in the case of gimel chadashim, we have an element of vadai, as we discussed earlier, because even if Eliyahu Hanavi would say she's not pregnant, she still would not have yibum. But if, for example, in the cases of achos zikukaso and the like, where the Rabbanan said there is no yibum, then we really should apply the principle of no chalitza. Now, watch what happens. A woman falls for yibum, and she's as achos zikukasa. And now you're going to tell me that the Rabbanan said we won't allow yibum, and therefore there's no chalitza. So what's her status now? Midaraisa, she's Yevamot Lashur. She's not allowed to get married. She needs chalitza desperate. And now you're telling me that kol she'ena ol yibum, because the Rabbanan said she can't have yibum, ain't ol chalitza. You know what that's called? What's the official name for a woman who can't get married? Aguna. She's an aguna. With the Rabbanan instituted isur of achos kukasa, which makes it impossible for this woman to get married. So here we're going to have to bend the rules, and we're going to have to assume that that we're going to allow chalitza. Because if we don't allow chalitza, then since midaraisa she falls for yibum, she can't marry anyone without chalitza. So this is what I see over here. If you're looking at this first paragraph here on the left side that we saw, he says, Kol elu shemidrabanan einon choltzos, and he gives you a list. If nesar olel lachlos, if we're going to insist that there's no chalitza, and why is that? Because since eina ol yibum eina ol chalitza, is then tis agen li'ol. From now until doomsday, she's an aguna. Yalkeni tiru lo lachlos. Special heter. It's like Haimon Ruvahimon. The Rabbanan were the ones who said that there's no yibum, which would mean therefore there's no chalitza. And they said no, that she gets chalitza because otherwise she'll be an aguna. Achaoneg yontif ochiach midivrei Rashi shekol she'enan olos liyibumach masofei harein kruyos enon olos lechalitza. exactly the opposite of what we've been assuming in Rashi. Rashi said that if it's only a suffix, then olos lechalitza. He's saying if ain't olos leyibum, ain't olos lechalitza, even in the case of suffix. So before ain't release this yamen, kilgabenu ain't suffix. V'lulei shehem misagnos li'olam haynu osrim aleim lachlos ad shiva isbar speaking. As Rashi seems to be invoking the principle of igun in order to justify chalitza. But if there was no issue of igun, then there would be no license for chalitza. Again, when we say no license for chalitza, we mean as long as the suffix is an outstanding suffix. Once we clarify the suffix, like in the case of Havchan of Gimel Chadashim, after the Gimel Chadashim, we know she's not pregnant, then for sure we can give a chalitza. But as long as the suffix is a suffix, she really doesn't allow, we don't allow chalitza. We're going to allow chalitza only in the case of the igu. But lulei shemis agnos, the olam, hayinu osrim aleim lachlot ad she's bar speak. Below Omra Hagimara Shaspekos Ena Begeterena Oli Ella Besafek Shal Yedei Taroks. Under what circumstances will we allow for evil? And it's nothing to do with ego now, even though there's no possibility of evil. And that's going to be a Safek Al Yedei Taroks. What's Safek Al Yedei Taroks? Keep going. Kidesh achas mishtei akos. V'lo yadua lemi. What the vav here is again. Ein yadua lemi meis below bonim. So a man married one of two sisters. And he died. But which one is his wife that falls for evil because she was married to someone who didn't have children? We don't know which, because we don't know which wife, the valid was validly, if there's such a word like it, validly married. Ishtayan asuras b'yimo. He shema achosa. He yivimto v'hi asur olam mishum achos asa. I said Rachel Leah. You don't know which is the real Yevamot. So on the side that Rachel is the Yevamot, then Leah is the sister of his Kukali Yavam. He bezikas yivimto amitis yesh din yibu el shen yadu amiu. And in such a case, we have a suffix al yidei taroves, and we require chalitza. Each one is going to require chalitza because she might be a chos kukasa. All of the suffix tarot. in besofik ach, imu ach, vada yesh bezikasa din yib, sheyeduim hu imzeu achi bail. Aval the Yevama she sofik erva, or shehi asura mishum sofik, nimtza she'en bezikasa din yibu before. Vayolanu lifso es chalit soso. Yachash Rabbani asur bimu im al yideshin esra lachlos hitasagim v'yolam lo tikkun chacham sheba din kol she'ino oliyavam ino olcham. Saying that this principle that there's no chalitza applies in Suffolk al Yidei Tarovis. The Yevamashi Suffolk Soras Erva, why should that be different? The Achar Shehi Asura Shum Suffolk she'ed bezikos in Hebrew before. Gavenu hates Suffolk. Think of together. Together in a whole understand why suffix source error is different. In such English, oh, I think I'm getting something. Coming slow. You ever had this feeling where like you think you see a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's very dull. It's very. I think he's saying the following: that in some cases he's basically categorizing spakos into two different categories. He's saying one category is she's either in Yibum or she's out of Yibum. Like, let's say, for example, we don't know if she was married to Shimon or she wasn't married to Shimon. I mean, if she wasn't married to Shimon, then there's no yibum. It's not like there's yibum, but she's an Erev or something like that. But then you have another case where it's quite possible that what?
There's something here. It's a Zika relation.
Well, which category are you talking about? The first category of what he calls something like they taromas, where there is chalitza, or the second category, just so we know we're on the same page. So in the second category, which is not suffik al yidei tarovet, the case where there is chalitza. But that's called suffik al yidei tarovet. There is chalitza. Why is there chalitza? Because the suffix to do away with chalitza is because she's not in the parish of Yibum. She's just simply not married to Shimon. If she's not married to Shimon, then the whole issue of chalitza is a bland issue. I mean, what difference it makes? So she's not married to. Let her get chalitza anyway. Well, what did I lose?
Well, one of them is
right. One of them is married, so each one is going to need chalitza on the tzad that she's a regular yavama. There's no erev or anything like that. Let me see. I mean, again, I'm not sure if it's all going to work out. Then you have a second category where there's no chalitza. Why? Because we know that she should theoretically be ololiyibu, but we have a problem that she might be an erev. In such a case, she doesn't get chalitza. Why? Because we have to worry about the problem that maybe she's not an erev. And if she's not an erev, she needs yibum. And if she needs yibum, then she right? If 1 second. If she's not an erev, then she needs yibum. But why aren't we allowing yibum? We're not going to allow yibum because she might be an erev. If she might be an erev, then we apply the principle of kol she'ena ol yibum ena l'chalitza. Why? Because then she's in the pash of yibum, but we're, so to speak, disqualifying her because of the law of erev. In the case of a man who married one of two women, if this is not the woman he married, then there's no yibum at all. So the tzad to say that she should not have chalitza is just because she's not in the parish of yibum. She's not related to the deceased brother, meaning to Shimon. In that case, we say, what do we lose by asking for chalitza? We can only gain. But in the second case, the reason why she should be completely excluded from chalitza is because she's completely excluded from yibum. She is in the pash of yibum, but she's an erva. But let me just see if it works out in the language. It says the following. Okay, so that's going to apply in the case of a suffix taurus erev, according to this Onig Yontif. But what about the Gemara that says that in Spekos we will apply chalitza? That's called a suffix al yidei taromas. There we're going to demand chalitza. Right, so we can't allow yibum in the case where he married one of these two sisters because she might be achos. Second. right? She might be achos kukasa. Right, on the side that she wasn't married. So if she wasn't married to him, then we can't allow Yibum because she is the sister of Skukasa, which is a rabbinic category of an East. But as far as Chalitza is concerned, we're going on the side now that she is married to Shimon, and she has a Zikas Yivim to Amitis, she has a true Zikas Yivim, and that's something we'd apply to both Rachel and Leah, these two sisters. Each one has the possibility of being in the Parsha of Yibum. We can't allow Yibum because she might be Achos Kukasa in event that she wasn't married to Shimon. But on the other hand, we don't lose anything by allowing Chalitza. That's how I think I'm interpreting. That's I think what he means. L'chein b'safek ach. Imu ach, then he has a din of Yibum. We can't allow Yibum because he might not be an ach. 1 second. No, that doesn't make any sense what I just said. Imhu ach. Vada yesh b'zikasa din Yibum. Oh, yeah, on the side that he's not the Ach, then you have the Isur Yevamot Ashur. She's only allowed to marry at this point the Yavah, but we don't know which one is the Yavah. But in such a case, there's no problem in requiring Chalitza, because we're requiring Chalitza for someone who's not even an Ach on the side that he's not an Ach. So that's not a loss. Oh, but now we'll get to the case of Yevamot. She's Safek Tzaras Erva, and here we're going to say that Eina Ol Yibum, Eina Ol Chalitza. Why? Me'achar she Asura Mishum Safek Nimtza she'ein b'zikasa din Yibum before. It's not that she's out of the whole, Parsha of Yibum. She's not an ach, but this guy's not an ach, or she's not married to Shimon. But here we don't know if her status as a Tzaras Erev. The achar she asura. We can't allow it to implement Yibum because she might be a Tzaras Erev. Is then we add the word before. That's the key word here, before. Nimtza she'ein b'zikasa din Yibum before. But she might actually be Zekuka, but as far as implementing the Yibum before, that we can't allow. And in such a case, Hayalonu lifsol es chalitzasa. Should really apply the principle called she'ena olos liyibum, ena olos lechalitza. Why? Because she might be ena ola liyibum we did erev, which means that he cannot implement the mitzvah of yibum, although there is a zikas yibum. Then, in a case of Aguna, the Rabbanon are going to waive that Isur and they're going to allow her to receive Chalit. So, does anybody follow what I'm saying? Again, I can't promise you I'm right, but he's taking a whole different perspective here. Until this Oneg Yontiv, we were assuming, and that's for sure the way the Maharsha understood Rashi, that Eina Ola Liyibum, in a case of Safek, she is Ola Lechalitza. She requires Chalitza because there's a possibility in Safek that she needs Yibum. We can't allow the Yibum to take place, but she needs Chalitza. unless we introduce a vada into the equation. Like, for example, during that 3 months of Havchana, even if Eliyahu Hanavi would come, it would make no difference. There is no Yibum. That's a vada. So whenever there's an element of vada, then Rashi says that ain't ola l'chalitza. But if it's a suffix, then it's ola l'chalitza. Now the Aron Yotiv is turning it the other way around. He's saying ain't ola s'liyava machmas suffix is then ain't ola l'chalitza. So until now we've been assuming, and that's apparently the Maharsha's understanding of Rashi, that in case of suffix there will be chalitza. Why not? And comes along the Aron Yotiv, and he interprets Rashi as saying that if there's no yibum machmas suffix, then there is no chalitza. But, says the Aron Yotiv, when the Gemara says that in the case of suffix, she does get chalitza, that's a different type of case entirely. That's a case of what's called a suffix machmas tarovis. And machmas tarovis means we don't know whether she's included in the whole, in all these diagrams of relatives. We don't know. And there we don't lose anything by chalitza. But if we know that she's in this whole diagram of chalitza, but we might exclude her from yibum because of befal, there might be there's a suffix that maybe there's an isur befal. In that case, we have to apply the principle of kol she'eino yibum, eino la chalitza, because then yibum and chalitza are both included in the same suffix. As to whether there's an erva, whether there's zika, and so forth and so on, is there a din yibum or not? But in the first case, the category of suffix machmas taroves, we're not saying that the yibum and chalitza are all in the same category. Is there a din yibum? Is there no din yibum? What we're saying is that maybe she's not even on the chart. She's not even related. In such a case, we don't lose anything by requiring chalitza. All right, this is where we'll stop for today. And tomorrow, we're going to go back to the Gemara and Daf Gimel there, and we're going to start the sugya of Abba Shol. And the sugya of Abba Shol is the last piece here on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Okay then, so that's what we want to pick up in Mirza Hashem. I wish everyone a great day.